everyone to the fourth edition of the interview series hosted by GDG Inspire. My name is Giulia Dino Giacomelli and I am the founder of GDG Inspire. Every month we deliver the StratCom PO, so our newsletter that features one interview with an expert and one review of a specific strategic communication related matter. This month we have the pleasure to have with us Galen Lamphere-Englund, who is the co-founder of the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, EGRN, as well as a strategic communications expert in the field of PCVE, so prevention and countering violent extremism. Galen, good afternoon, good morning. Maybe for you it's morning and not afternoon already. Pleasure to have you. First question for you. I was mentioning you co-founded the EGRN. Where did you get this idea, really? I mean, what was the kind of background that brought you to set it up?
Firstly, Julia, thank you so much for having me on the StratCom's Pill. And I really like the approach that you've taken with bringing interesting insights into all of your interviews. So thank you very much for having me. The EGRN started out as a project born from two different spheres of my head. I've always been a gamer. I've always enjoyed video games my whole life, from the time I was, before I could talk till much later. And I've also been an extremism and conflict researcher for my entire professional career. And I started to see a lot of the violent motifs and narratives from VEOs and from terrorist organizations that I studied in my day job showing up in online video games and communities around them in more increasingly directional and targeted ways. So there's always been kind of garden variety toxicity, whether that's misogyny or homophobia or Islamophobia, present in gaming communities, but that started to get much more targeted and weaponized. So about 4 years ago or so, I put out some messages to other researchers and practitioners to say, who else is looking at this? What else are you seeing? And that gradually started to snowball. So we formed the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, originally with my co-founder, Jessica White, over from RUSI. And then over the years, it's grown and kind of become its own thing. So we're now 155 members across the world, everyone from tech platforms to researchers, to practitioners, prevention folks. And we're now also a 501c3 nonprofit in the US. So we actually have an entity, and we continue to kind of bring together conversations and research at that topic.
Oh, that's outstanding. I mean, what you manage in such a little time. Indeed. Would you like to perhaps share with us what are, the main goals, but also the activities of the network?
Absolutely. So the network is built around 4 pillars that follow pretty logically from the core idea, right? What's the intersection between extremism and gaming? Pillar number 1 is around convening. So we bring together our membership every month. So again, that's a mix of our tech partners, law enforcement, researchers, practitioners, government folks. We have Chatham House rules discussions on a new piece of research or an interesting intervention or prevention approach that one of our members is working on. We debate it. They're open fora that are, I think, a bit rare in this space. There's interesting interactions, and everyone's there because they're passionate about the topic and they genuinely want to make the world a bit safer, a bit more peaceful, and a bit more inclusive online. So we have our convening work that also spans into outreach with our members. We have partnerships with GNET, the Global Network on Extremism Technology, and GIFCT. So we push out our members' insights through publications with them. And we also try to work on broader level outreach and convening at conferences and at individual briefings. So that's the convening side. Then that spills into our research pillar, which is exactly what it sounds like. We set out a research agenda 4 years ago on trying to understand the prevalence of extremism and terrorist exploits across gaming platforms, as well as how that varies across geographies, ideologies, and so on. We've come a long way in answering that core research question, but lots more questions that kind of span from that space. So we work to try to collaborate and come up with research that is non-duplicative. A huge problem in the PCVE and terrorism research space more broadly is people running at the same question, not trying to actually do so in a scientific way, right? But just working on the exact same question in the same way without collaborating. So what we try to do on the research side is say, how do we get people to work together on complementary questions? And so that comes both through our collaborative effort to come up with research agendas and set them. And then we also deliver research projects as the EGRN. So we have some work funded by Public Safety Canada, multinational surveys, we do data gathering exercises, and we have a new extremism and terrorism game database. So we have our research work. Then there's the training side. So we do trainings for tech platforms, for trust and safety teams, for law enforcement, for regulators, and for policymakers on this issue set. That goes anywhere from 15 minutes to multi-day trainings. And then lastly, we do advising and prevention work. So highlighting good prevention practices, including digital stratcoms in gaming platforms, trust and safety team friction-based approaches, positive intervention modalities. We try to collate those practices across our members to figure out what works, what doesn't, where it seems like there's maybe more evidence needed, and then distribute those. Say, look, these are promising practices that are worth investing in. So that's more or less what the network does across those four pillars. And we continue to grow and build our practice as time goes on.
Wow, a lot in the, let's say, in the pipeline as well. I have a question with regard to the activities. Mainly, do you have policymakers in your membership? And if not, how do you make the insights that you generate through the network available for policymakers? Because I think there is a lot there that can be picked up in policymaking.
Fortunate that we have quite a few policymakers who come along to our monthly meetings. Some participate formally and they're named members. Others come in an individual capacity just out of a desire to learn. So we do have a pretty good individual engagement that comes across with our policymaker colleagues. But then we do formal pieces as well. So we'll put out policy notes and guidance. We also do, as part of that training side, individual bespoke briefings for policymaking entities. So regulators or law enforcement bodies or congressional or parliamentary bodies too. So we have kind of a mixed approach, but we really try to make sure that we're getting the information out there into the hands of folks who can actually use it.
How relevant is the issue of extremism, in fact, in online gaming platforms today? So can you give us perhaps some recent examples so that we can perhaps grasp what is really the level of threat we are talking about?
Generally, I try to break this down into two broad categories. The type of organic threats that emerge out of online social spaces, of which gaming is a huge one, and the strategic use case, which is where violent extremists or targeted hate organizations directly try to use video games and kind of adjacent communities for their own purposes. So on the organic side of that, we see things like various degrees and forms of online toxicity that create fertile ecosystems for various types of extremism. So recent surveying that we've done, for example, found that around a third of respondents across 7 countries were exposed to images or symbols promoting extremism in games. 38% saw people endorsing violence against a targeted group. We've also seen people reporting widespread harassment, widespread misogyny, and targeted violent misogyny, which we know is correlated to support for violent extremism in many settings. So we see this as kind of online organic toxicity that takes place. We also see on the strategic side, the production of video games and mods by violent extremists and targeted hate organizations. So my colleague, Emily Thompson, and I just came up with a database of 30 years worth of extremist and terrorist related games and modifications for games. We've documented 155 of these over the last 30 years. They span the gamut from far right, white supremacist and neo-Nazi games to jihadist games, to games created by Hezbollah, and then things like Black Pill or school massacre ideation games that are kind of ideological hybridization of different forms of extremism. So we see like the actual creation of games. Then there's the gamification of violence. So the use of strategic elements in attacks, the live streaming, for example, on Twitch, which is a gaming adjacent platform. That, of course, started with the Christchurch attacker but then has been duplicated by all manner of far-right and acceleration attackers up to, I believe yesterday, there was another live stream attack. So this continues to kind of proliferate. The iconography in that is designed to mirror first-person shooters. It puts people in what we call a play frame. So when you're viewing it, it feels like you're inside of the game itself. It's immersive. And we've seen attackers directly referencing that kind of immersive game-like element as part of their own radicalization. So the Bratislava attacker, for example, referenced that in his own manifesto. So we see this as a successful tactic to engage audiences, to draw them into the narrative, and then to give them little things to hook onto, right? Effective propaganda hooks in the game-like elements of the gamification.
Have you observed a difference in scale throughout the years that you have been researching this field?
Yeah, I mean, from the historical perspective, we've seen a huge spike in the number of mods created since 2020. We've also seen kind of general spikes around historical waves in geopolitical conflict that has an extremist element. So around the Second Intifada, for example, in Israel and Palestine, we've seen kind of a spike of content. Or more recently, we've seen a spike in white supremacist content around 2020 that then has kind of continued to this day. So we do see that games mirror reality. They don't exist in a vacuum. And I think it's important to always keep in mind, like, games don't necessarily cause violence, right? Games are used as online social environments to interact with other humans. And because of that, they mirror the rest of our social realities as well.
Yeah, it's a mean to an end, no? And it doesn't really surprise me that it kind of follows the reality, right? Because when there is a need and there is a grievance and to express certain community sentiments, or there is an occasion to push for extremist messaging, whatever mean is legit, so to say, to achieve an end. So it doesn't surprise me, but thanks for sharing these insights based on your research, actually. In terms of audiences, have you observed that certain audiences are more susceptible to extremist activities on gaming platforms? And if so, which are these audiences and why do you think they are more susceptible than others?
So I think that's a really interesting question. And when I was thinking about it, went back to some of our research over the last couple of years. From a statistical point of view, there's no one audience demographic that seems to be more or less susceptible. When we dive into that more, there does seem to be a correlation between duration of gameplay and potential susceptibility to violent extremist ideologies. A bit more gameplay seems to make people more resilient, but an extreme amount of gameplay seems to make people less resilient. That's probably linked to a lot of other social demographic variables. Who plays games for 40 hours a week, right? What else goes in line with that? From the case studies where we've actually seen individuals radicalized via gaming platforms, it tends to be younger audiences who are seeking a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, who find online communities and a strong sense of identity through those communities. But when those communities happen to be extremist communities present in gaming platforms, that can go off the rails really quickly. So we've seen that in Singapore with a group of teenagers who were radicalized into ISIS. We've seen the same in Germany with neo-Nazi groups. And of course, the Buffalo attacker in the US also was present in a lot of gaming communities that had far-right links that played a part of his radicalization pathway. Gaming rarely, like with any factor, gaming is rarely the only piece involved, but it's an important one and one that's often neglected. So I think it's why it's worth paying a bit more attention to.
Is there any research that finds that is able to link, let's say, online behavioral types on gaming platforms and correlate them to offline behavioral types? I mean, is there a sort of typology of specific extremist gamers, so to say, and what are the offline features? I mean, is there any research on that? I mean, I understand it must be very difficult to conduct this kind of research, but just wondering.
Oh, you're asking the holy grail question, right? Like, what's the online offline transmission link? The short answer is no one has a great answer for that. The longer answer is there's more data and evidence than we used to have. Julia Ebner and colleagues out of Oxford recently came up with their extremist hate speech terminology that tries to link online vocabulary to offline action. I mean, there's something in there. We've also kind of looked at a similar taxonomy around online hate speech and how that might link into offline practice.
Cultures, yeah.
Yeah, the cultural side is interesting. Violent, targeted misogyny and deeply misogynist communities seem to also link quite closely to support for violent extremism in online settings. So that type of particular violent targeted misogyny appears to potentially link to a higher propensity for offline behavior. Again, these are indicative findings. Other spaces that we think are really important to look at are the questions around exposure versus actual behavior, right? So for example, the highest rate of exposure to extremist content for our polling and polling from ADL is in Call of Duty. But Call of Duty is also one of the world's most popular first-person shooters. So just because there's a higher instance of exposure, does that necessarily mean that there's a higher likelihood of Call of Duty players engaging in offline violence? Hard to say. Again, is that just a correlation with exposure, or is there actually something more positive at play there? That being said, last point on this would be the types of cultures of gameplay I think do matter. Shaping more positive online environments inside of individual games and nudging player behavior to be less misogynistic, for example, or less bullying is both a good business practice. It keeps people from leaving the game, and it likely encourages more pro-social behavior that doesn't seek to exclude and target others on the basis of a protected identity characteristic. So I think there's ways to shape more positive online communities, but when it comes to that causal link between online behavior and offline engagement in violence or engagement in radicalization, no one has quite cracked that yet. Like there's some interesting indicative signs, but nothing perfect.
In a certain way, in an adjacent field, but there is research about how counter narratives can be ineffective. So what you're basically saying is we need to perhaps have more, I mean, to dilute the space with more positive behaviors and more pro-social behavior. It would not just work to shut everything down or regulate it in a way that people do not have access to that type of game and adrenaline source, because we know that they will find it somewhere else. So I understand. I mean, what you're saying, I think it's at the very core of Stracoms eventually. You recently published for the RAND Policy Support with Menzo Hargers a paper outlining the challenges and opportunities of public-private cooperation, specifically in the field of online gaming and PCV, so preventing and countering violent extremism. This is, of course, at the very core of strategic communications, so building partnerships between private actors and public entities. What are the main paper's findings? And if I may ask you to focus on perhaps one specific gap, one solution that you found, and what are the limitations as well within the private sector's current approaches to dealing with extremism, and on the other side, what are the limitations for public sectors in understanding the gaming ecosystem as a whole?
Thanks. Thanks for bringing up that paper too. It was a fun one to work on because we spoke with a bunch of folks from public sector as well as from gaming companies. We got an interesting sample of people's challenges and opportunities in the space. On the public sector side, there's a deep lack of understanding around what modern games and gaming ecosystems are, right? Games are social. Often gaming spaces involve many, many layers. So you're not just playing the game, you're also playing and engaging with all these adjacent platforms and servers and fora that are played alongside the game itself or engaged with alongside the game. So you have this massive social vibrant ecosystem. That's not really understood by most public policymakers. And there's still this really unfortunate old bias that games probably just cause violence because there's violence in video games, which is not the case, right? Debunked many, many, many times now over the years. So providing a baseline understanding of what gaming spaces are is core to creating better regulatory or enforcement or monitoring or positive engagement. Like any sort of engagement depends on this fundamental understanding of what gaming ecosystems are. That's on the public side. On the gaming sector side, there's this related fear of stoking a moral panic around games. So if you think back to the Columbine school shooting in the late 90s, that kicked off this massive moral panic around games. The perpetrator did play Doom, but that had nothing to do with the fact that he went on to go and shoot up a school. This was based on faulty reporting at the time that was later debunked, but it stoked a massive moral panic around games and Dungeons and Dragons that was incredibly toxic and destructive for players and for companies. So there's this fear of stoking moral panic. So what gaming companies need to do is recognize that they're right now about 5 to 10 years behind social media platforms in terms of how they engage with toxic content, with extremism, with mis and disinformation. So there's a need to recognize that all of the social elements in gaming platforms require thoughtful engagement or users' experiences, and frankly, to get ahead of the regulatory curve that will eventually catch up. So the answer there is to acknowledge the problem, recognize that it's not inherent to games, but that there is a genuine issue with malicious actors exploiting gaming for their own ends. And to ignore that creates a less safe environment and one that ultimately is much more at risk, both of being exploited and of being overregulated or regulated in a really unhelpful way.
Thanks. I mean, I think what you are saying is, is crucial. Having observed the public-private cooperation space, for a while, it's true that social media platforms in general have learned a lot since 2014 onwards on how to get ahead of the curve of the regulatory approach. Also at the EU level, so much has been going on now with the DSA, with the TCO. So eventually it's gonna happen and it's gonna fall on them as well. So as you said, and that's why I think the EGRN's work is so crucial, to build capacity also within the private sector on how to stay ahead of the curve and kind of anticipate the next regulatory waves. So thanks for your work on that. We all talk and start using AI, right? AI is the buzzword these days in the tech in the tech environment, but also in the extremist environment. What impact do you anticipate in enabling AI on gaming platforms? For example, has it already allowed to better target potential recruits? What is the sort of use of AI that is currently being engaged with on gaming platforms? And I want to ask you both in terms of threats, but also in terms of potential opportunity.
On the threat side, there's already documented use cases of extremist and terrorist organizations using generative AI to design new propaganda, right? That's pretty well documented at this point. Far-right handbooks that have been distributed on Chan boards on how to use Gen AI for designing and creating propaganda, right? On the gaming side, gaming adjacent platforms, we see the proliferation of Gen AI imagery, some of which might include game-based iconography and propaganda. Okay, relatively low use case or low risk use case. A high risk use case, or at least a more interesting one, is the use of generative AI engines to create games. Those are not massively available on the market yet, but 87% or so of gaming studios are already using various generative AI tools to create games. Now, on the same time, you also see far-right and white supremacist extremist groups designing their own game engines to create kind of your own targeted hate game, right? So you can create a level-based shooter that's anti-Semitic or is Islamophobic or is anti-LGBTQ. So you can really rapidly make these mini games. Add that with generative AI, game creation technology, and you'll be able to make relatively sophisticated extremist games a lot more easily. So what does that mean? Higher volume of extremist content, higher volume of extremist games, and potentially more engagement with kind of those particular types of gaming modalities. So that's one area you see it. On the mitigation side, there's massive room to use various types of AI tools for trust and safety. So one of our EGRN members, Modulate AI, uses generative AI to monitor voice chat in games and try to flag for abusive content, for toxic bullying, but also for extremist or terrorist recruitment attempts. We also see Xboxes implemented more of this. When you do a voice report, if you're playing Xbox Live, it sends the last 30 seconds of the voice chat along with a report that can then be analyzed with AI tools to flag for potential problematic content. The moderation of voice chat has been a long time in coming. Text chat's much easier, right? But voice chat's a lot harder. And generative AI tools or large language model tools have come a long way in helping that. So I think there's a lot of potential there to kind of improve the use cases and especially to develop more open source tools for like studios that don't have the resources to pay for expensive solutions. So it's nascent, but I think there's a lot of room to do better work there.
We should watch the space, basically. I mean, as for everything else concerning AI.
Definitely.
Very much developing at a high pace. So to conclude, what we usually ask to our experts is whether they have any books, podcasts, any material that they would recommend to our readers and watchers.
Absolutely. Thankfully, we have a list of books, podcasts, and videos we've put together on the EGRN's website, so extremismandgaming.org/research. You'll find that divided between short policy briefs, longer books by our members, research papers, and then a whole slew of videos and podcasts on the subject over the years. If there's one book that I'd recommend, it's Extremism in Gaming, The Radicalization of Digital Playgrounds. It's a Routledge compilation of chapters put together by Linda Schlegel and Rachel Cowart, two of our members, earlier this year that came out. And it's free, it's open source, which is fantastic. And it's a great primer to a lot of the questions in the space. So you don't have to read the whole thing. You can grab a chapter or two. It's also a shameless self-plug because I've got some writing in there as well, but it's a really good read and it covers a lot of different bases from a bunch of our members and great folks thinking about this space.
We will definitely check that out. Thanks a lot for the recommendations. Thanks for sharing with us your knowledge and what the EGRN does, which again is really, really relevant for PCVE, not just for gaming, but ultimately for the whole field. So thanks a lot. See you soon.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate the conversation. And for anyone who's listening over time, feel free to get in touch if this sparks any interest.
Yeah, will do. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.